The Ethelgard dust settled around Kalen Vane's boots. 30 Korger pulse rifles leveled at his chest, their targeting lasers painting his work shirt in scattered red dots. He didn't raise his hands. Instead, his fingers wrapped around the hilt of a curved silver blade, pulling it free with a soft, metallic whisper. He wasn't surrendering. He was cataloging them. I wish I could say that was the most terrifying thing I saw that day. If you think you know how a slaughter ends, stay close. 3 months earlier, the only thing Kalen had been cataloging was the nitrogen levels in Sector 4. Ethelgard Reach was supposed to be a quiet agricultural colony, a place for growing things. Out in the high-altitude fields, the wind bit hard. Scylla Thorne, lead botanist for the settlement, stood on the ridgeline and observed her most frustrating laborer. Vesperians were a species built on logical hierarchies and visible credentials. Kalen Vane had none. He possessed only a stubborn silence and hands permanently stained with dark Ethelgard dirt. Scylla checked her datapad. The yield from Sector 4 was up by 18%. She noted his technique down in the valley. Standard soil enrichment required breaking the top crust to allow nitrogen compounds to bond with the underlying root systems. If you didn't fracture the earth, the plants would starve. Her academic texts called it constructive trauma. You had to break the ground to save the harvest. Kalen applied the fertilizer with mechanical precision, moving without a wasted step. He was a proclaimed pacifist. When the younger colonists brawled in the mess hall, Kalen simply walked away. He never raised his voice. He never complained about the grueling shifts. Yet, there was an undeniable weight to him. Scylla had noticed the key during his second week. A heavy brass key, worn on a thick chain around his neck. It had slipped from beneath his collar as he bent to adjust a broken irrigation valve. The metal was dull, worn smooth by years of friction against his collarbone. It didn't match the cheap, standardized locks used on colony doors. It matched the box. Every colonist was subject to a storage inspection. When Scylla had audited Kalen's sparse sleeping quarters, she had found an alloy stasis crate shoved beneath his cot. It was matte black, devoid of identifying markers, and sealed with an archaic mechanical lock rather than a digital keypad. When she cited regulations requiring storage documentation, Kalen stepped between her and the crate. He hadn't threatened her. He had simply looked at her, and for a fraction of a second, the agricultural laborer vanished. The void staring out of his eyes made her secondary hearts skip a beat. She had marked the crate as an exempt heirloom and left the room immediately. She assumed he was just another broken refugee. That assumption held until the system diagnostic cycle. Planetary midnight on Ethelgard was a suffocating, freezing dark. Normally, the low-frequency hum of the soil enrichment aerators running along the perimeter masked all other sounds. It was a comforting, steady vibration. But on the first of the month, the aerators powered down for a 3-minute recalibration. The silence was absolute. Then, Scylla heard the tremors. It was a silent, rhythmic thudding against the thin hab wall separating their units. Scylla stepped out into the freezing corridor and approached his door. She bypassed the faulty lock, intending to offer medical assistance. She thought he was having a seizure. He was sitting dead center on his cot. Kalen was locked in a rigid sweat, his muscles corded so tight they looked ready to snap. His hands gripped the heavy brass key on his chest, holding it like a physical anchor against a storm only he could see. Scylla had backed away slowly. She felt pity, assuming the Vanguard insurgency had left him with severe echoes. She thought he was a victim. She was wrong. The sky turned to fire 2 weeks later. No warning sirens. No demands for tribute. Korger Raider dropships breached the upper atmosphere, their thrusters screaming as they dropped straight into the colony's central plaza. The concussive wave shattered the glass in the hydroponics bay. Plumes of black smoke spiraled into the Ethelgard sky. Through the haze, hulking figures in spiked armor began a systematic sweep of the settlement, kicking in doors and dragging screaming colonists into the dust. Scylla dropped her datapad. Panic gripped her chest, constricting her gill slits. She scrambled toward the main hab block, the sound of tearing metal and barking Korger commands echoing behind her. A hand grabbed her shoulder. It was Kalen. His face was a mask of stone. The pity she had felt for him during those midnight tremors evaporated instantly, replaced by a sudden, chilling paranoia. He wasn't panicking. His eyes were tracking the dropship vectors, calculating angles and deployment times. He dragged her into his quarters and shoved her toward the reinforced subfloor cellar. "Stay down," he instructed, his voice devoid of any inflection. He didn't wait for her to argue. He slammed the heavy metal hatch down, plunging her into the dim emergency lighting of the cellar. The metal hatch was freezing against Sila's palms as she pressed against the grate. She expected him to hide. She expected him to barricade the door and pray the raiders moved on to richer targets. Through the narrow slit, she watched his boots. He didn't run. Kalen reached under his shirt. He pulled the heavy brass key from his neck. He knelt beside the cot and dragged out the alloy stasis crate. The key slid into the mechanical lock. The hiss of depressurization filled the room. Kalen reached inside. When he stood, he was pulling on an archaic, floor-length military duster. In his right hand, he held a sheathed blade. The agricultural laborer was gone. Sila pushed the heavy cellar hatch up just enough to peer through the fractured hab unit window. Smoke from the breached atmospheric processors choked the settlement. The colony square had been transformed into a holding pen of shattered glass, burning ozone, and absolute despair. Warlord Draxos towered over the kneeling colonists, dragging the settlement governor by his collar. The quarter leader barked a laugh that rattled the window panes. His warriors fanned out, their weapons hot from the initial breach. They were veterans of a dozen massacres, confident in their absolute authority over the unarmed civilians. The quarter raiders moved with the cold, synchronized, predatory efficiency of a pack that had consumed a dozen defenseless frontier worlds before this one. Their heavy spiked armor clanking against the settlement's prefabricated pathways as they systematically rounded up the remaining terrified survivors. Sila held her breath. She saw Kalen emerge from the alleyway. The archaic duster swept the ground, collecting ash. He didn't rush. He walked with the slow, measured cadence of a man who owned the space he occupied. Every step was deliberate. Sila realized with a sickening twist in her stomach that the midnight tremors hadn't been echoes of trauma. They had been physical withdrawals. The man was a weapon, and his body had been fighting the biological instinct to deploy. He stepped into the center of the square. The raiders noticed him. Weapons raised. He stood motionless in the dust, that curved silver blade slipping free from its sheath. Draxos sneered, issuing a harsh, guttural command to execute the lone fool interrupting his conquest. Sila watched his chest rise and fall. 30 armed raiders against one agricultural laborer. It should have been a slaughter. And it was. He was already behind them. Kalen bypassed the visual processing speed of the Vesperian eye. He didn't charge the firing line. He collapsed the distance using an angular slide, dropping below the initial volley of plasma fire. The superheated bolts scarred the earth where he had stood. He hit the first raider at the knees. The monofilament blade didn't flash. It simply occupied the space where the quarter's pulse rifle barrel used to be, shearing the hardened alloy in half without a sound. Before the ruined weapon hit the ground, Kalen's palm drove upward, shattering the warrior's visor and concussing the skull beneath it. Sila couldn't look away. It was a terrifying, beautiful geometry of violence. He wasn't fighting. He was editing the battlefield. 2 more raiders pivoted, their heavy boots kicking up ash. Kalen used the momentum of his first strike to spin, the heavy duster flaring out to obscure his true position. He trapped a descending rifle butt with his left forearm, stepping inside the guard. A rapid series of nerve strikes to the raider's brachial plexus sent the massive alien crumpling into the dirt, paralyzed but breathing. He wasn't killing them. He was dismantling their capacity for violence. Sila realized the immense, horrific discipline it required to move at that velocity and deliberately pull every lethal strike by a fraction of an inch. To crush a kneecap instead of severing an artery. To snap a collarbone instead of removing a head. To exercise total, unyielding mercy in the center of a massacre. The quarter realized they were not fighting a farmer. They broke formation, falling back into a loose perimeter, firing wildly. Plasma scorched the hydroponics bay and melted the plaza statues. Kalen wove through the crossfire like a ghost. He used their mass against them, pulling one raider into the trajectory of another's blast, then sweeping the legs from both. Draxos bellowed in fury, realizing his squad was being dismantled by a phantom. The warlord dropped the governor and unslung a heavy rotary cannon from his back. The barrels began to spin, emitting a high-pitched whine. Kalen didn't retreat. He launched himself off the central water reclamation tank, vaulting over the panicked fire of the surviving guards. He landed squarely on Draxos's chest plate. She watched his hands lock around the warlord's thick neck. The stubborn, dark Ethelgard dirt permanently packed beneath Kalen's fingernails stood in stark contrast to the blinding, pristine edge of the monofilament saber now pressed flush against Draxos's throat. The rotary cannon hit the dirt. Draxos froze, a single bead of blue blood welling up where the blade kissed his scales. Kalen finally spoke. His voice was quiet, echoing across the silent plaza. "Drop them." The remaining raiders let their weapons fall. A Terra Prime admiral arrived 3 days later, speaking in hushed tones of a ghost operative. Sila's own grandfather, a retired Vesperian general, traveled across the sector just to bow his head to the farmer who had once spared his life. Kalen never acknowledged the titles. He simply returned to the fields, the heavy brass key resting outside his shirt, no longer locking away a weapon, but securing the promise of a quiet harvest.